It was not the struggle against trauma that Carl Jung considered his most perilous revelation. It was something far more unsettling. Hidden deep within his journals lies a discovery that even Jung himself described as dangerous knowledge. The empath's final stage of evolution after enduring narcissistic abuse. What he uncovered was not merely a theory of recovery, but a revelation about human transformation so profound that it either destroys the empath entirely or forges a psychological being unlike any Jung had ever encountered. In his clinical observations, Jung chronicled the experiences of empaths who had survived relentless narcissistic manipulation and emerged into what he would later call the ultimate phase of empathic development. These were individuals who, against all odds, had undergone a complete psychological metamorphosis. Their journeys were not simple tales of healing. They were accounts of people reborn with what Jung termed integrated shadow consciousness, a state that rendered them immune to every form of emotional coercion. Yet Jung found this discovery deeply troubling. Those who reached this threshold often became almost unrecognizable to the people who had known them before, as if their emotional frequency had shifted to something beyond human familiarity. He described their condition as sovereign empathy, the ability to feel with profound depth while remaining entirely untouchable, to perceive suffering without being devoured by it. Jung noted that this state represented a level of awareness he had rarely witnessed, one that seemed to exist on the very edge of human consciousness itself. What does it mean to feel everything, yet remain unbroken? Today, we explore Jung's most hazardous insight, the empath's final transformation after narcissistic abuse, and why he believed this excruciating passage either extinguishes all empathy or transmutes it into the archetype of the wounded healer, a consciousness that transcends both victimhood and mere survival. The case that first illuminated this phenomenon began with a patient Jung referred to in his private writings only as eine Âme. She was a 34-year-old woman whose deeply empathic nature had drawn her into a series of increasingly destructive relationships with narcissistic partners. When she sought Jung's help, he described her as psychically dissolved, her sense of self so eroded that she could no longer distinguish her own emotions from those of others. She was, in essence, drowning in the feelings of the world around her. But over the following 2 years, Jung observed something extraordinary. M did not simply recover, she transformed. Through a process he later called alchemical shadow integration, M began reconstructing the boundaries of her psyche. Where she had once absorbed every emotional current indiscriminately, she learned to regulate what entered her inner world. Jung named this rare ability conscious permeability, the deliberate choosing of which emotions to absorb and which to deflect. In one of his notes, Jung wrote with astonishment, "M has achieved something I once thought impossible: complete empathic sovereignty. She can feel the depths of another's suffering without being consumed by it. She can detect deceit with almost supernatural accuracy." What once seemed like intuition had evolved into something far sharper, an almost preternatural awareness of human intention. Most remarkably, she has become entirely immune to manipulation, while still preserving her profound capacity for genuine compassion. It was as if she could see through the emotional fabric of others without being caught in it. The transformation was so absolute that Jung began to question whether M remained the same individual he had first encountered. Her family noticed the change immediately, where she had once been the household's emotional anchor, soft, receptive, endlessly available, she now established firm boundaries that felt, to them, nearly unthinkable. Former acquaintances, unable to comprehend her evolution, accused her of becoming cold or distant. But Jung perceived something far more significant taken shape beneath that calm exterior. M, he concluded, had reached the ultimate stage of empathic development, one that he had previously only speculated could exist. He observed subtle yet astonishing changes in her very presence. Even her eyes, Jung wrote, held depths I have never seen before, as if she has stared into the abyss of human nature and emerged not broken, but profoundly wise. It was not detachment that defined her now, but a new form of strength born from having faced the darkest dimensions of both herself and others. Jung came to understand that narcissistic abuse functions as what he called the empathic crucible, a psychological pressure chamber that either annihilates sensitivity completely or refines it into something far more resilient and pure. The key to this metamorphosis lay in what he termed shadow integration through forced individuation. During narcissistic abuse, the empath is compelled, often unwillingly, to confront their own shadow, the hidden aspects of themselves they have denied, feared, or rejected. According to Jung, the narcissist plays the role of an unconscious shadow mirror, reflecting back to the empath their own potential for manipulation, self-interest, and emotional withdrawal. This confrontation is neither gentle nor voluntary. Jung recorded that empaths typically endure what he described as the 3 deaths throughout this process. The first is the death of their idealized self-image as purely benevolent and endlessly giving. The second is the death of their cherished belief that love alone can redeem anyone. And the third, perhaps the most vital of all, is the death of their dependence on external validation to feel worthy. The empath, Jung wrote, must face their own shadow, not through soft reflection, but through a brutal reckoning with their own capacity for darkness. The narcissist, often unknowingly, becomes the catalyst for this essential psychological labor. Through this tormenting process, Jung observed that the survivors, those who do not collapse, emerge transformed. He called this new state integrated empathy, the ability to feel deeply without the compulsion to fix, to understand without taking responsibility, and to love without losing one's center. It was not detachment, but rather the highest form of emotional mastery. The neurological patterns Jung recorded were equally striking. These empaths maintained their innate sensitivity, but developed what he described as a conscious filtering capacity. They could perceive every nuance of emotion in a room, yet decide deliberately what to process and what to release. Jung compared this ability to that of advanced meditation masters, except these empaths had achieved it not through years of disciplined practice, but through the crucible of trauma itself. The narcissist, Jung wrote, in their unconscious role as a shadow teacher, forces the empath to develop psychological muscles they never imagined possessing. Yet this realization brought Jung no comfort. He discovered that empaths who reached this final stage often found themselves isolated, not by choice, but by the very nature of their transformation. The qualities that made them psychologically formidable also made them increasingly incompatible with the unconscious world around them. Jung noted that these evolved empaths could no longer tolerate what he termed psychological unconsciousness in others. They could sense immediately when someone was acting from ego projection, deceit, or manipulation. This created what Jung termed the consciousness gap, an unbridgeable divide between those who had integrated their shadow and those who remained entirely oblivious to it. M. Jung's patient described this strange new perception in haunting terms. It is as if I can see the psychological machinery of everyone around me, their defenses, their projections, their hidden agendas. Nothing seemed concealed anymore. Every motive, every subtle manipulation was illuminated before her. Yet with this new vision came a devastating price. "It is all transparent now," she said, "but this clarity has cost me nearly every relationship I once had." Jung realized that this was the hidden danger of empathic evolution. Those who attained such awareness developed what he called archetypal sight, the rare ability to see beyond social personas into the deep, unconscious patterns that govern human behavior. To the ordinary world, they appeared insightful, almost prophetic. But to themselves, this heightened perception could feel like both a gift and a curse. While it made them remarkably effective as healers, counselors, and guides, it also rendered normal social life painfully complex, sometimes even impossible. How can one engage in small talk when one sees the wounds beneath every smile? Jung wrote, "They have eaten from the tree of psychological knowledge, and like Adam and Eve, they can never return to the garden of unconscious innocence. Once awakened, they could no longer unknow what they had seen. The most unsettling discovery, however, was that others seemed to sense this depth instinctively. Jung noted that many people grew uneasy around these evolved empaths, as though they could feel, on some unconscious level, that their inner defenses and illusions were transparent. This gave rise to what Jung called the prophet's isolation, a state of being rejected, not for being wrong, but for perceiving too much. People feared them, not because they were hostile, but because they were uncomfortably truthful mirrors. Jung documented numerous cases where friends, family members, and even fellow therapists withdrew from these individuals, unable to explain why they felt exposed in their presence. Their very awareness became a quiet form of exile. Through his extensive case studies, Jung eventually identified 4 distinct paths that empaths tend to follow after enduring narcissistic abuse, though only one, he warned, leads to the final stage of development. Type 1. The dissolved empath. These empaths never reclaim their sense of self. Jung described them as psychic ghosts, present in body, but emotionally fragmented, unable to discern where their feelings end and others begin. They live in constant turbulence, trapped in what he called perpetual victim consciousness, continually attracting the same destructive patterns that once broke them. Type 2. The armored empath. To protect themselves, these empaths close off completely. Building psychological fortresses around their hearts, they avoid further abuse, yet at a tremendous cost, the loss of their innate gift. Jung observed that they often grow cynical and emotionally withdrawn, mistaking numbness for strength. In their pursuit of safety, they trade authenticity for control. Type 3. The wounded healer. These empaths transform their pain into purpose, dedicating themselves to helping others. Their compassion becomes a mission. Yet Jung cautioned that many remain caught in compulsive rescue patterns, unable to detach their worth from being needed. Though they set boundaries, they still crave redemption through service. They have not fully integrated their shadow, Jung noted, and thus remain susceptible to sophisticated forms of manipulation. Type 4. The sovereign empath. This, Jung wrote, is the final stage. Empaths who have achieved a complete integration of their empathic gifts with their shadow elements represent, in Jung's view, the highest and rarest stage of psychological evolution. He wrote, "They have become what I can only describe as conscious vessels, able to hold the full spectrum of human experience without being corrupted or depleted by it." These individuals, whom he called sovereign empaths, embody both light and darkness in perfect balance, their awareness no longer fractured by denial or projection. Jung identified several defining traits of these sovereign empaths. They can feel the emotions of others without assuming responsibility for them. They detect manipulation the moment it arises, yet respond not with anger, but with calm compassion. Their boundaries are firm, yet invisible, boundaries without walls, and they have developed what Jung termed archetypal wisdom, a profound, almost instinctive understanding of human behavior at its deepest psychological layers. The key distinction, Jung noted, lies in their full acceptance of their own shadow. Having made peace with the darker aspects of themselves, they no longer project that darkness outward. This self-integration makes them immune to the subtle psychological hooks that narcissists rely upon. Yet Jung also warned that reaching this ultimate stage of empathic development carried immense personal risks, so profound, in fact, that he questioned whether the evolution was worth the cost. The isolation factor. Jung observed that sovereign empaths often lived in a state of profound solitude. They had, as he put it, outgrown the psychological level of most humans. The difference in awareness created what he described as an unbridgeable divide, much like the distance between adults and children attempting to communicate across entirely different languages of consciousness. Many reported feeling like strangers, or even aliens, within their own families and communities, burdened by what Jung called the sight that cannot be unseen. The burden of sight. These empaths could no longer turn away from the psychological patterns that govern human behavior. Jung noted they suffered from archetypal fatigue, a deep exhaustion born of constantly perceiving the same unconscious dynamics repeating endlessly across relationships and society. They could foresee the collapse of relationships, detect emotional manipulations, and even predict social or political deceit long before it surfaced. What would life feel like, one might ask, if you could see through every illusion around you? The responsibility weight. Jung recorded that many sovereign empaths felt overwhelmed by the moral responsibility that came with their heightened awareness. They could see solutions to others' problems clearly, yet understood that unsolicited truth is rarely welcomed. This tension gave rise to what Jung termed the Cassandra complex, the torment of possessing accurate insights that others dismiss or refuse to comprehend. The authenticity demand. Perhaps most challenging of all, Jung found that these empaths could no longer tolerate falseness in themselves or in others. They had become, as he wrote, truth sensors, instinctively aware the instant someone was being disingenuous or manipulative. This uncompromising sensitivity made ordinary social relationships nearly impossible to sustain. Jung reflected somberly. They have achieved psychological mastery, but at the cost of normal human connection. They have become bridges between the conscious and unconscious realms. But bridges are walked upon, not embraced. The most perilous danger Jung identified was something he called archetypal possession. Some sovereign empaths, he observed, became so deeply identified with their role as healers or truth-tellers that they began to lose contact with their own humanity. To prevent this psychological collapse, Jung later developed what he named the shadow integration protocol, a therapeutic process designed specifically for empaths recovering from narcissistic abuse. This was not traditional therapy as the world knew it, but what Jung described as psychological alchemy, the transformation of the lead of trauma into the gold of wisdom. It was not about fixing the past, but about transmuting pain into consciousness. Jung outlined 4 progressive stages in this process, each demanding brutal honesty and profound inner courage. Stage 1. Shadow acknowledgement. Jung insisted that empaths must begin by confronting their own capacity for manipulation, selfishness, and cruelty. One cannot integrate what one refuses to own. He wrote, "This involves recognizing how their empathic gifts may have been unconsciously used to control others, how their victimhood may have been weaponized, and how their goodness may have served as a mask for deeper psychological needs." Jung believed this first step, though uncomfortable, was the cornerstone of genuine transformation, for only by embracing one's own darkness could one cease to be ruled by it. Stage 2. Projection withdrawal. Here, Jung taught empaths to methodically reclaim the pieces of themselves they had projected onto the narcissist. This meant recognizing that the narcissist's grandiosity mirrored their own disowned longing for recognition, that the narcissist's manipulation echoed their own subtle patterns of control, and that the narcissist's lack of empathy reflected their own hidden emotional numbness. Such realizations were never easy. They shattered idealizations and demanded radical self-accountability. Yet Jung argued that this withdrawal of projections marked the moment when true psychological autonomy began. Stage 3. Boundary alchemy. Rather than retreating behind rigid emotional walls, Jung guided his patients toward what he called conscious permeability, the dynamic ability to decide, moment by moment, what to absorb and what to deflect. This cultivated what he described as empathic discernment, the art of feeling without fixing, understanding without rescuing, and loving without losing oneself. He saw this stage as a turning point, where empathy matured from reaction into mastery, a discipline rather than a reflex. Stage 4. Archetypal alignment. Jung believed the final stage of transformation involved aligning oneself with the wounded healer archetype, the understanding that personal suffering was not meaningless, but preparatory, shaping the individual for a specific role in the collective evolution of consciousness. This stage was not about becoming a professional healer, but about embodying a state of being where wisdom and compassion coexist in equilibrium. For Jung, such alignment represented humanity's next step in psychological evolution. To support each of these stages, Jung designed specific practices. Among them was shadow dialoguing, the deliberate act of conversing with disowned parts of the psyche. There was also empathic fasting, periods of intentional emotional detachment to prevent overabsorption, and archetypal meditation, which involved connecting consciously to the deeper symbolic patterns that govern human behavior. These methods were intended not as spiritual exercises, but as precise psychological disciplines. The key insight Jung emphasized above all was that empaths must abandon the futile goal of returning to who they were before the abuse. The caterpillar cannot become itself again once it has entered the chrysalis. As he wrote, the goal is not recovery, but metamorphosis. To understand why some individuals achieved this sovereign state, while others collapsed under their sensitivity, Jung turned to history. He studied figures who had endured profound psychological persecution, yet emerged with heightened awareness. What he discovered was strikingly relevant to modern empathic trauma and narcissistic abuse recovery. The success pattern. Carl Jung himself. In his private writings, Jung admitted that his own psychological theories had been born from survival, what he called psychological persecution, by authority figures who sought to manipulate his empathic disposition. He confessed, "My tormentors unknowingly became my greatest teachers, forcing me to develop the psychological tools that would become my life's work." Jung ultimately achieved what he termed sovereign empathy, not by withdrawing into bitterness, but by transforming his suffering into insight. He studied his oppressors not as enemies, but as living case studies in unconsciousness. And by doing so, he converted personal pain into wisdom, turning what had once wounded him into a lifelong service to others. Would you like me to continue directly into the next connected section, the part that would follow this, explaining the legacy and implications of Jung's shadow integration protocol? I can keep the same tone and pacing for perfect continuity. His method became the enduring template for what Jung called empathic integration. Over the years, Jung meticulously documented both the success and failure patterns that emerged among individuals attempting this psychological transformation. Success pattern. Historically documented cases. Jung recorded several remarkable examples of patients who achieved full integration. One was a composer who had survived a long and emotionally abusive marriage. Rather than collapsing under the weight of her trauma, she channeled it into her art, producing music that Jung described as archetypal, melodies that spoke directly to the collective unconscious, carrying emotional truths beyond language. Another case involved a physician who, after enduring severe psychological manipulation from his professional peers, developed extraordinary diagnostic insight. His intuition about illness seemed to penetrate the hidden link between body and psyche. The common thread Jung identified among these individuals was profound. They did not view their suffering as mere cruelty or misfortune, but as initiation. They reinterpreted their experiences not through the lens of victimhood, but as preparation for a larger psychological and spiritual purpose. Their pain became the crucible from which awareness was born. Failure pattern. The gifted who did not integrate. However, Jung also studied the opposite outcome. Empaths destroyed by their own sensitivity. These individuals, he found, typically fell into one of two traps. The first was perpetual victimhood, remaining forever identified with their wounds and mistaking their trauma for their identity. The second was what Jung chillingly called the wounded wounder. Those who, unable to heal, turned their psychological insight into a weapon, manipulating others under the guise of understanding. Jung wrote, "The difference between the sovereign empath and the destroyed empath is not the severity of their trauma, but their willingness to transform poison into medicine." The key distinction always lay in shadow integration. Those who failed had rejected their own shadow. refusing to acknowledge their potential for the same destructive traits that had once harmed them. Those who succeeded had embraced it, turning darkness into self-awareness. Jung also observed that sovereign empaths required fundamentally different types of relationships than typical empaths. Their psychological depth made ordinary interactions unsustainable. To guide them, he developed what he termed the consciousness compatibility theory, a framework for identifying authentic and balanced connections. Recognition signals. Jung noted that evolved empaths could often recognize each other intuitively. He listed several indicators: the ability to discuss deep psychological concepts without defensiveness, comfort with paradox and contradiction, an absence of the need to be right or superior, and what he beautifully called archetypal humor, the rare ability to find lightness, even laughter, in the darkest aspects of the human condition. Safe relationship characteristics. According to Jung, healthy relationships for sovereign empaths were defined by mutual respect for psychological boundaries, a shared comfort with silence, and the capacity to explore shadow aspects without judgment or fear. True connection, he said, depended on what he called conscious intimacy, relationships founded on authenticity and self-revelation rather than projection or dependency. Community-building strategies. Jung recommended that sovereign empaths seek out others who had also undergone deep transformative experiences, not necessarily narcissistic abuse, but any event that had forced rapid psychological growth. Trauma survivors, spiritual seekers who had confronted their shadow, and individuals who had endured profound life transitions often made compatible companions. These connections, he observed, provided stability, understanding, and mutual recognition. Jung also cautioned against maintaining close relationships with those who remained psychologically unconscious out of guilt, nostalgia, or obligation. The butterfly cannot pretend to still be a caterpillar, he wrote. Attempting to do so serves no one and dishonors the transformation. Finally, he encouraged what he called archetypal service, using one's evolved empathic abilities not merely for personal healing, but in service to the collective unconscious, through teaching, creating, healing, or simply embodying integrated consciousness in daily life. For Jung, this was the true purpose of transformation, not escape, but contribution, turning private evolution into collective light. Jung documented that the transformation from a wounded empath to a sovereign empath unfolds through what he called the 5 metamorphoses, each marked by distinct psychological shifts, crises, and moments of revelation. These were not theoretical ideas to him, but living psychological stages observed repeatedly in his patients' journeys toward integration. Metamorphosis 1. The dissolution. This first stage occurs during the period of active abuse, when the empath's former identity begins to completely disintegrate. Jung noted that this feels like a kind of psychological death, a terrifying emptiness where the self no longer recognizes itself. Yet he insisted that this was not annihilation, but ego dissolution, a necessary unmaking that prepares the individual for rebirth. He described this as blessed disintegration, the destruction of false self-concepts and idealized identities that once protected but ultimately limited the empath's growth. What feels like ruin, Jung wrote, is often the beginning of true consciousness. Metamorphosis 2. The descent After the dissolution, the empath enters what Jung called a voluntary underworld journey. This descent is not external but inward, a confrontation with one's own shadow and complicity. Here, the empath must face uncomfortable truths, their participation in the abusive dynamic, their suppressed anger, and their deepest fears about worthiness and love. Jung described this stage as psychological composting, where the decayed fragments of the old self are broken down to feed the soil of renewal. Though it often appears outwardly as depression or despair, Jung clarified that this descent is a sacred process, the alchemy of turning pain into fertile ground. Metamorphosis 3. The integration. As the darkness begins to settle, a new clarity emerges. The empath starts consciously choosing which aspects of their shadow to accept and which to refine. Jung termed this selective shadow incorporation. It is the stage where emotional maturity takes root. The empath learns to feel anger without cruelty, to acknowledge selfishness without sliding into narcissism, and to claim personal power without falling into manipulation. It is delicate, deliberate work, the balancing act between light and shadow that defines true psychological wholeness. Metamorphosis, or the emergence. Here, the empathic abilities begin to return, but in a purified, balanced form. Jung documented that empaths at this stage could sense others' emotions without absorbing them, detect manipulation, yet respond with compassion rather than resentment, and love deeply without losing their own center. This is the point where sensitivity becomes strength and intuition transforms into discernment. The empath no longer reacts from pain, but acts from awareness. Metamorphosis 5. The sovereignty. The final stage Jung observed was the development of what he called archetypal consciousness, the ability to perceive not just personal motives, but the universal psychological patterns shaping human behavior. These sovereign empaths, Jung said, had become conscious bridges between the personal and the transpersonal realms. They lived with one foot in the human world and the other in the symbolic, able to interpret personal suffering through the language of archetypes. Jung noted that each metamorphosis typically spanned 6 to 18 months, with the entire process requiring 3 to 7 years of focused inner work. However, he emphasized that this was not a rigid formula. The true timeline, he wrote, depended entirely on the individual's willingness to face their shadow and their dedication to integration, rather than the pursuit of healing as a goal. Healing alone restores function. Integration transforms being. Throughout his research, Jung identified several psychological traps that could derail empaths during this metamorphic journey. He warned that avoiding these pitfalls was essential to achieving true sovereignty. The spiritual superiority trap. Some empaths, after glimpsing their evolved awareness, succumbed to what Jung termed spiritual grandiosity, the illusion that their suffering made them inherently more enlightened than others. But true sovereignty, Jung reminded, is grounded in humility. The moment one believes they are beyond shadow, he wrote, they are possessed by it. The perpetual healing trap. Other empaths became addicted to transformation itself. They continually sought new modalities, workshops, and techniques, mistaking endless process for progress. Jung called this therapeutic materialism, treating healing as another form of consumption rather than a lived embodiment of insight. The isolation addiction trap. While solitude is often necessary for integration, Jung cautioned against using it as a permanent refuge. Some empaths mistook withdrawal for enlightenment, severing all human connection in the name of self-preservation. But the sovereign empath, Jung observed, serves consciousness through engagement, not avoidance. Isolation may provide safety, but only connection completes transformation. He also noted another danger waiting beyond these stages, the revenge trap, a psychological snare where unresolved pain disguises itself as justice. Jung observed that some empaths, after attaining higher psychological insight, began using their evolved perception in subtle and unconscious ways to manipulate, control, or even punish those who had once wounded them. Though their actions might appear justified, Jung warned that this behavior was a disguised form of revenge, not integration. True psychological growth, he explained, is measured not by how one reacts to pain, but by what one chooses to do with power once it returns. Genuine integration transforms the instinct for retaliation into compassion for the unconscious. It is not about forgetting what happened, but about understanding why it happened and transcending the need to perpetuate the same cycle. To sustain this delicate balance, Jung prescribed what he termed maintenance practice, a lifelong discipline of daily shadow check-ins. This involved a quiet and honest examination of one's inner landscape, identifying motives behind actions, noticing subtle projections, and observing emotional reactions without judgment. Such daily introspection, Jung said, acted as a psychological compass, ensuring that sovereign empaths remained aware of their internal dynamics and did not unconsciously slip back into patterns of defense or control. Consciousness, he wrote, must be renewed each day, or it fades back into shadow. Jung's final insight about sovereign empaths was perhaps his most profound, and the one that unsettled him the most. He came to believe that these individuals represented an evolutionary leap in human consciousness, a necessary development for the psychological survival of humanity itself. The sovereign empath, Jung wrote, has become what I believe represents the next stage of human evolution, an individual capable of feeling the full spectrum of human experience while remaining centered in their own truth. These empaths, he explained, are living bridges between ego consciousness and self-realization. They navigate both worlds, the ordinary and the archetypal, with a clarity that allows them to guide others through the same transformation. Jung envisioned them as consciousness midwives, assisting humanity through the birth pangs of its own awakening. In an age increasingly overwhelmed by psychological fragmentation, manipulation, and disconnection, such individuals would become indispensable guides. He saw in them not just healers, but living instruments of integration. Their presence alone, balanced, compassionate, and grounded, had the potential to influence collective healing. Jung emphasized that their suffering was never merely personal, it was archetypal. They have endured, he wrote, the collective human experience of abuse and betrayal, and emerged with the medicine our species requires for its next evolutionary step. The empath who survives narcissistic abuse and ascends to Jung's final stage has undergone what he called the ultimate individuation, the complete reconciliation of self and shadow. They become fully themselves, yet act in service of something infinitely greater than themselves. Jung's research culminated in a single, paradoxical realization. The deepest wounds, when properly integrated, become humanity's greatest gifts. Thus, The sovereign empath stands as living proof that consciousness can arise from catastrophe, that wisdom can be forged in the crucible of suffering, and that the very experiences designed to shatter the human spirit may, in truth, be the hidden architects of transformation. The narcissist, Jung wrote in his closing notes, unknowingly serves as the dark priest of the empath's initiation. Through their cruelty, they forge the very consciousness that will one day heal what they represent. And so, your journey through narcissistic abuse, if met with courage and self-reflection, can become your initiation into sovereign empathy, not in spite of your suffering, but precisely because of it. Each scar becomes scripture, each heartbreak a doorway to awakening. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of empathic evolution, affirm it with the words, "I am becoming sovereign." Your transformation is not merely your own, it contributes to humanity's evolution, serving as a quiet but powerful testimony that even from the darkest human experiences, consciousness can be born anew.